Hello and welcome to a bonus episode of the Principal Liner Notes podcast. This is Sean Gaylord here. And a couple of things in this episode. I will be talking about a particular piece of music which is celebrating its 20th anniversary today. It's an album that means a whole lot to me, and I'll share you a little bit about that. And then some bittersweet news about how the Principal Liner Notes podcast is winding down. As George Harrison sang on his beautiful 1970 album, All Things Must Pass, the podcast must pass. But don't worry, if for those of you who have been faithful listeners and faithful viewers, I will not be done with podcasting by any stretch of the imagination. It's kind of fitting today, in speaking of the podcast finale for the Principal Liner Notes podcast, and today is the 20th anniversary of the release of Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, his masterpiece, Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. And this is an album that I have written a whole lot about. I think I've devoted easily maybe 7, 8 episodes to the podcast on this album alone, and I've probably made 20 odd references, probably more, to this album. And when I think back to how it was 20 years ago today that I got out as soon as I could from R.J. Reynolds High School. I was high school English teacher during that time, and I dutifully drove to the nearest Borders. Remember Borders Books and Records? Oh my gosh. There was one located maybe no more than 10 minutes away from the school where I taught. And I remember picking up a CD version of the album. I was so excited. I was so happy. I couldn't believe it. And going over to the cafe, and I brought my little Sony Discman, and I listened to that album from beginning to end in one sitting. And I was just overwhelmed by the emotional and symphonic and conceptual impact of this album. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, this is an album that Brian Wilson, when he was in the Beach Boys, this album was the fabled follow-up to the 1966 album Pet Sounds. And Pet Sounds, as you may or may not know, it's considered to be one of the greatest albums ever made. It is an album featuring such great songs as God Only Knows, Sloop John B., Wouldn't It Be Nice? But it's an album in which the Beach Boys, led by Brian Wilson, were breaking away from their surfer image and embracing much more orchestral music, symphonic music, and using the studio as an instrument, and writing songs about maturity and growing up and loss, and coming to terms with love and all of the intricacies and complexities that love takes on. And the album was so influential that when Paul McCartney heard it, he went to the Beatles and said, "The Beach Boys have made the greatest album of all time. What are we going to do?" Paul didn't know that Brian Wilson had heard the Beatles album, Rubber Soul, and felt that they had made the greatest album of all time. And so he set out to do the same. Well, anyway, in the follow-up to Pet Sounds, Brian Wilson wanted to stretch music even further, and become even more conceptual, and really wanted to reflect what was going on in the 60s, and psychedelia, and bands were experimenting and making concept albums and writing obscure lyrics, and setting poetry to music. So he collaborated with the great lyricist and musician Van Dyke Parks, and they set off to write what Brian Wilson called a teenage symphony to God. In many ways, you can view the album as a portrait of the American dream. And when I um, would teach the album, I would always do it through that frame in my American Lit classes. Well, anyway, the album was never finished, and it was shelved for a host of reasons. Brian Wilson dealing with mental health challenges. Also, he really couldn't get the rest of the band on board with the direction of the album, and so the album was shelved and was unfinished. And a couple of things kind of crept out from the SMiLE sessions from the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys did do kind of a truncated version of that album on an album called Smiley Smile, and different songs were released from those sessions, such as Heroes and Villains, which was a top 10 hit for the Beach Boys. Um, Good Vibrations, which was that number 1 million selling smash, kind of served as a prelude to the promise of what SMiLE was going to be, just kind of large, grand, modular music with those lush harmonies of the Beach Boys and the musical backing of the LA studio musicians known as the Wrecking Crew. And I remember reading about this album in a Beach Boys biography and thinking, wow, this was an album that had sort of a mythic status, an album that was going to rival Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that many who had heard it or had heard pieces from it said that it was beautiful, that it was like a Da Vinci painting, and it was something that was going to stand the test of time. So this notion of masterpiece is something that I greatly value and appreciate and still do. So I I admit I picked up some bootlegs of the SMiLE sessions and tried to piece together my own SMiLE album. And that album took on a lot of personal significance for me. And when the album was released in 2004, it really served as a bit of inspiration for me, for Brian Wilson to kind of revisit an album that many saw as failure, for an album that many people thought was too experimental and too obtuse, and that the audience wasn't going to connect with it, and for him to have the courage to go back and revisit this album, and to revisit maybe some of that pain of loss and disdain that he may have felt in the composing of the album, and surrounding himself in the right conditions with a supportive band of musicians who believed in this project, and giving him the courage to finish the album. He got back with Van Dyke Parks, and they added some additional lyrics and finished out the album, and ended up performing the album live from beginning to end, and it was quite successful. And so seeing this album in its form, an album that I didn't think would see the light of day, kind of serves to me as a lesson in the perseverance or persistence of vision and believing in your vision. Very much a nod to the Pepper effect. And if you have the right people around you who support that vision and support what you're doing, great things can happen. Nothing can stop you. The album went on to not only to some critical acclaim and best-selling acclaim, but it did win a Grammy Award for Best Instrumental, the song from the Elements suite, the song known as Mrs. O'Leary's Cow. And it is a beautiful, beautiful album. I highly recommend that you pick it up today, not just for the music and not just for the production and the arrangements and the fact that you are listening to a work of art, but a reminder that even though an idea may fall flat, even though someone may scoff at your creativity or scoff at you trying to be innovative, don't put that on the shelf. Hang in there and persist and believe in your vision. And most importantly, find others who believe in that vision with you and will collaborate with you and help you create your masterpiece. So a nod today of gratitude to Brian Wilson and his album Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. Highly recommend it. As I mentioned on my social media channel, last night, the Principal Liner Notes podcast is coming to an end, for many reasons. Nothing bad, but I just feel like I've kind of like Brian Wilson, when he was recording all that surf music. It was time to move on, and it was time to perhaps push the boundaries of creativity and expression to a different level. And that's what I wish to do with a different kind of podcast, that will be around the corner soon. I do want to say that I am so grateful for everyone who has tuned in and supported this podcast over the last 8 seasons. This is a homemade podcast. I don't use any studio trickery. I don't have giveaways, or I don't have an extensive mailing list. It really is coming from my heart to yours. And when I've always done the podcast, I always think about that person who is feeling alone, who is feeling isolated, who doesn't feel understood. And it's kind of my way of reaching out to you to let you know that you're not alone, and that everything's going to be all right. So we do have probably about 5 or 6 more episodes of the Principal Liner Notes podcast left, and we are going to go out with a bang. I'm excited about the guests. And I do want to say thank you to all of the guests who have been on the podcast. I cannot be more grateful and honored that out of all of the podcasts that you have chosen, to join this little homemade podcast, and be a part of the conversation. So, Principal Liner Notes will go on a hiatus. It may or may not be permanent. I do have another idea for a podcast that I'm really excited about, that I hope to have come out in the next several weeks, probably mid to late October, early November. And I've been working on it behind the scenes and structuring an outline, and I'll be making an announcement about the name of that podcast and the theme of that podcast in the next week or so. So, as I always sign off, don't forget to share with the world your dreams, your visions, your ideas. The world needs them, and you help make the world a better place. Happy birthday to Brian Wilson, presents SMiLE, and thank you for being a part of the conversation and being part of this podcast today. Look forward to catching you on the flip side, so stay tuned.